I'm privileged to be joined today by Dame Ruth Cairnie, Chair of Babcock International and also board member at BDE and Serendipity Venture Capital. Thanks so much for being here today, Ruth.
Delighted to join you.
It's a real privilege to be talking to you. Your career is absolutely extraordinary. So let's maybe start at the very beginning. What led you on a pathway that spans energy, defence, technology and engineering? How did you begin?
Okay, well, I think the first thing to say is that there was no grand plan. So it's easy to look back and it all has a nice logic, but the reality was that it was a series of moves and opportunities, and that's how it played out. But I think a really important first point is I went to a girls' school, and in senior school I had an absolutely fantastic physics teacher. So I loved physics. I was fascinated by it. And that led to me going to university after school to read physics and maths. So that was a really important start to the whole thing. I then made a short diversion into academia. So I spent a while studying general relativity at university. And that was actually fulfilling what had been a long-term dream, to spend my life studying general relativity. And after not too long doing that, I made a really important decision, which was that although I'd wanted to do it for ages, I realized it wasn't really right for me. And that what I wanted to do was still really high quality research, but something that was more tangible and working on problems that were kind of relevant to the real world and solving problems that needed solving now. So that was a really big thing, to change direction. I looked around for the kind of organization where I could do that kind of work, and that took me to Shell. So I joined Shell in one of their research centers. And at that time, Shell had really big research establishments. It invested a lot in research. And so by that move, I had the opportunity to do what I had decided I wanted to do. I was working on things like solving equations about what would happen and what would the safety issues be if a liquefied petroleum gas sphere exploded, for example, or working on development of products, new products, oils and fuels, and how would they perform. And that was the start of a very long time in Shell. So I got into the energy sector, and I actually spent all of my executive life in Shell. So with a significant first phase in research, then a move out of research into the business, which I had to lead a really strong, prolonged campaign to achieve, because it was a career route that did exist, but it was pretty unusual. Mm-hmm. And then a whole series of roles in business, mostly in so-called downstream commercial roles, interspersed with strategy and business development roles. I think 4 overseas assignments. And eventually, at the end of all of that, spending 3 years running group strategy for Shell, based in The Hague. And then that took me to a bit over 10 years ago, when I left executive life, and I was looking for a portfolio of non-executive director roles, which is what I have now. And I think I just naturally gravitated to more engineering and technical businesses, because that's what I knew. I felt I understood how those sort of organizations would work. I'd be familiar with the culture. So it took me along the way into aerospace with Rolls-Royce, and now Babcock in defense, BT, telecoms, and Serendipity Capital, which is venture capital focused on critical technologies. So still a very strong sort of engineering and technology theme.
Mm-hmm. And what a mix, what an array of such important critical industries as well to be involved with. So how would you describe your leadership style today? And you mentioned the campaign as part of your run through there.
Yes. Well, I think the best way for me to answer that is not to think about what I would say, but actually to tell you what people do say. Mm-hmm. Because part of the pattern being the chair of a company is that you get feedback each year from the other directors about how you're chairing the company, and that's required under the governance expectations. So what they would say is, I think, probably number one, very high on clarity. So clear setting of direction, able to cut to the chase on what's really important amongst a lot of complex issues. So that would be probably number one thing. Second would be calm. So it's almost the sort of hotter it gets, the calmer I get. People would say that I'm inclusive, so that's good for this conversation. So that I create a team and a way of working where people feel they're welcome, that they're valued, and that they will be listened to. And with a mix of generally being very, very supportive of the team and of management and so on, but also able to challenge and be quite tough when that's needed. So I think those would be the highlights.
Excellent.
And I think it's quite interesting. I think it's interesting to think, well, where has all of that come from? Because I think we all start our careers with particular traits. And I would say for me in particular, I'm probably more of a problem solver than a relationship builder. Goes with being a scientist probably. I like solving problems. I like finding patterns and models, and that's how I think about the world. And that leads me to be more of a sort of big picture strategic person rather than a more sort of completer finisher focused on the details. And I think we all start with something, and then we have to build and compensate and develop other skills as we go along. So I think with that as a sort of the core ingredients, I think that feeds naturally into that sort of ability to give clear direction and clarity, and probably to the calmness. I think the inclusive and probably a lot of the support and challenge has come from the point in my career where I went from, success is about having the best answers, being the best problem solver, to the fact that it's all about working through people and through teams. So then everything is about pulling together, getting together the right team, and then finding the ways to motivate, to find the right ways of working, and to get the most out of that group of people. So skills learnt along the way.
Yes, absolutely, and how those evolve. So you mentioned inclusivity there, and maybe touched on this as well around how that's evolved. So can you share where you faced a situation where you maybe have not felt so included, and how that shaped your pathway and maybe your leadership values as well?
I suppose it's not a single instance, but the whole of the first phase of my career was one where, diversity and inclusion didn't exist. Nobody ever talked about diversity and inclusion. And I was repeatedly the only woman or the first woman or one of a tiny handful through a long period of the early stages of my career. So whether that's from being one of very few girls studying physics at university, when I went to that research establishment for my first job, I don't think there were any women managers in the site. There were very few women graduates. There was no one there that I could think of as a role model for, being a woman, having a career and a family, for example. When I got more senior and I was, I participated in a big management development course, which every up-and-coming manager in Shell went on. In the cohort of 30, I was the only woman. So it was a repeated experience of being the only. And I think I just got used to it.
I was going to ask, did you notice that so much? Or?
I just got to take it as part of what life was like. And I think that just gave me some resilience and some courage to just focus on the task and not get hung up about always sort of standing out and being, if you like, exposed in that way. And I think that, I'm not sure how or why, but I think that then sort of went further into taking the same approach when completely different opportunities came along. So whilst I was still in research, I had the opportunity to join a new team working on machinery engineering. I didn't know what machinery engineering was, but I said yes. And sort of with a I'll figure it out mindset. Way along the way, I went off to Singapore to run the supply organization for our business in the whole of the East. Didn't really know what supply was. So I think building on that sense of being alone and having to deal with things, I just think it became quite a muscle that I could use. And that all then, I think having learnt that, then the first time that I actually had someone who I think was a supporter and a sponsor, which was quite a long way down the road. And that was someone who really helped me unlock getting a role, and a very senior leader sort of noticed me, wanted to find out my background and where I'd come from, wanted to know what I was interested in doing in the future. And he used his influence to basically get me into a P&L role. And I think that coming together of me having developed that sort of quite strong sort of self-confidence, and then somebody sticking their neck out for me was really quite a catalyst to me thinking, I can make something work here.
A wonderful combination of being resilient and putting your hand up and somebody recognising and sponsoring and supporting that. Yeah, super. So you're partially answering this, I think, but what qualities do you believe are really essential for leaders of the future, and especially with a lens on supporting greater inclusivity and diversity in our organisations and teams?
Well, I think I think on the one hand for the sort of personal characteristics. So if I look to the future, my expectation is that the current state of huge uncertainty and very rapid change isn't going to go away. So leaders are going to have to navigate all of that change, uncertainty, have to make significant shifts to business models, deal with new threats, disruptions, whatever. So the things that are most important, I think, are going to be adaptability and resilience. And on a personal level, that's really important for a senior leader. I think that's very much about curiosity and courage. So sort of open-minded, always looking for what's going on, looking for new opportunities, new ways of doing things, and the courage to make big decisions and make them happen. But then you also will need the whole organization to be adaptable and resilient. And that means, I think, that you need really sort of diverse and inclusive organizations that work really well together, which means that leaders of the future will need EQ as well as IQ. They'll need the understanding of how to make organizations really work well.
So, Ruth, what does inclusive success mean to you personally?
So I think it's about being able to unleash the power of a whole organization. So, and that is really about, ultimately, it's about leadership style. Because if leaders operate by telling people what to do, I think you have vast reserves of experience, knowledge, ideas, effort that you're just not tapping into at all. So to my mind, what you're really aiming for is an organization where all of that is being unleashed to the good of the business's objectives. And so I think it's very much about that sort of focus on leadership. So just in Babcock, if I could just give an example, because over the last 6 to 7 years, we've been very much focused on transforming the business, improving its delivery, making it much more cohesive. But one critically important element of that has been shifting its culture. And I would say it's really about going from quite a traditional, more task-focused culture, which was quite top-down, to a much more people-focused culture. And that's bearing in mind that for Babcock, we really are dependent on our people. What we deliver to our customers is all about the skills and the knowledge and the attitude of people working on all the programs that we deliver. So it's absolutely essential. And how you do that, what you focus on, I think it sounds so simple, but it's about people want to be treated as people. So we all want to be respected, we want to be valued, we want the opportunity to contribute, we want to be heard, and our voices to be, have meaning. And so it's about how do you create an organization where that happens. And it feels as if it's not rocket science, but in practice, I think so many organizations just aren't like that. And the challenge is that, it needs to be right through the organization.
So that's such an important point you've raised around empowering people. So not telling people, but empowering people, and that people first culture. So you've championed diversity throughout your career, and we've just talked about the importance of culture. What are some of the approaches you've taken for having sustainable, durable, lasting culture that can alter as needed and evolve? But what are some of the practices or approaches you found that are really valuable?
Well, a number of things. But first of all, just thinking about changing and sort of focusing on diversity as well, because I think lots of organizations, are busy working on diversity and inclusion. And I think the most important thing, I keep saying this, but it's about leadership. If things are going to happen in an organization, it has to be a real priority. So diversity and inclusion has to be seen as a critical business priority, not to be done for its own sake, but to be done because it's critical to the success of the business. And that has to be owned by, in a company, the chief executive. It's a real leadership issue. The reasons that it's important need to be really clearly articulated for the specific organization, because you're not going to galvanize an organization to change towards something if you're using generic language that any organization could be saying. You have to really drill into and understand why it's important for you. In Babcock's case, it absolutely is about securing our future workforce. We have to be able to find and attract pools of talent. We can't be shutting out some of them because we've got such a task just to pull people into the organization. But for some, it might be very much about avoiding groupthink, or it might be about bringing in more sort of innovation and creativity. Or for retail organizations, it could be about making sure that you have the diversity in the organization so that you really understand the diversity of what your customers might want. So it whatever it is, it just has to be really linked very clearly to the specific challenges that your organization is facing, because then you can make it come alive and people get it, why it's important, and that you're not doing all of this because the corporate governance code says that you must or whatever. So I think that's really important. And then I think it has to be owned by leaders at all levels. So you really need to think about how you're cascading right through the organization. And why that's important is that, the culture that an employee experiences is primarily driven by how their line manager behaves and what expectations they set. And, the top leadership can be saying wonderful things about what they want, but that's not the reality that people experience. And so you have to get right down through the organization to what each employee is going to experience. And that's, the challenge of, in a multi-layered organization, how do you do that? And how you engage and how actually what's going on.
Yes, listening as well. Yeah, not just one direction.
How you go out and ask questions and listen and engage, and not just go and broadcast. It's very important that I think that is all being driven by the business leadership, and HR and specialist teams supporting inclusion and diversity. They have a role to play, but they're supporting, and it's not their task; it's the business's task to drive it.
Yeah. So very much having a leadership approach,
Yes.
but ingraining that across the business with ambassadors and listening as well, as you say, so importantly as well.
Yeah. And then, if you've started off with it's a real business priority, well, what does business do with priorities? They set plans, they measure and track performance, they follow up, they course correct, and they hold people accountable to deliver what you've agreed to deliver. Mm-hmm. And so you can easily see if that's happening for real or not.
Mm-hmm. And importantly, celebrating it when it's done well, but also, as you say, course correct where there's maybe some room for improvement. Ruth, tell me, how have you intentionally created space for diverse thoughts and voices to be heard?
I might start with a slightly embarrassing example of that,
Please.
Or rather the opposite. So a long, long time ago, I was put onto a team that was pulled together to support a very big change program. And the team, it was about 40 people from across different businesses, different levels in the organization, different countries. And we were sort of going to spearhead this change. And we were all brought together for a couple of days initiation. And then part of this was about team building. So we were broken into a number of sub-teams, and I think I was one of 7 or 8 people working on supply chain. And so our supply chain team, we had half a day of team building. And so we had all kinds of fun games and challenges, learning how we would work as a team. And we had to do team debriefs after each. And then we had observers who were looking at how we were doing and giving feedback. I remember it all as being terrific fun, but it was super high energy, sort of fast pace. Everything was against the clock. After about 3 of these, the observer fed back to us that we did have a Korean member of the team. And the observer noticed that because culturally, he wasn't trying to elbow everyone out of the space and get his voice heard. Completely accidentally, we just ignored him. And that was such a wake-up call. I mean, I think looking back, it's super embarrassing. But, we were just in our zone of sort of focusing on the excitement of the task and not really tuning in to all the ideas that were there at all. So I've carried that with me. And, I try very consciously now to think about, for example, when chairing a board meeting, I know that some of the voices are going to push their way in and be heard. Others might be shut out. And so I'm really attuned for that, and we'll bring people in. We'll make sure they get space. Sometimes I will kind of feed back to the group or reinforce the point just to make sure it gets the weight and the attention that it deserves. And I try to do really active listening and apply that especially to people where that voice, that communication style that I'm going to have less affinity with. So it's I think really it needs to be really conscious. And I know in my case it's an ongoing work in progress, but I think it's very important to continue to improve at this.
I like very much how you said that, work in progress. Nobody is perfect on this front, I think it's fair to say. And it's good for people to acknowledge maybe where there are some areas for improvement or errors learned. And it's then how you take that forward and being aware first and foremost, and then you can do something about it as well. So you meet with a vast array of organisations, Ruth, with your work. What are some of the common traits that you see across those organisations that are really leaning into and driving improvement with more inclusive and diverse teams and organisations, and maybe the flip side of that as well?
Organisations that are doing well, I would draw out probably 2 things. One is that being really specific. So owning your own business case and your own situation and understanding what to do about it. And I just talk again maybe about Babcock being really clear. We, due to the fact that defence is growing with all the geopolitical tensions and the fact that we have quite a changeover of personnel because we have a lot of people reaching the end of their working lives. So we need to bring 8,000 people into the workforce in the next 5 years. We have to work very hard at that. So, we need to be making ourselves visible, making sure that anybody who might potentially be a good recruit for us is aware of us and feels that we'd be a place that they could work. So we have to work very hard at that, and we know why it's important to us. And then, also being specific about where we're at. So, I think we are making good progress on the sort of entry level, so good diversity, particularly gender, on apprentices and graduates. We're doing well at senior levels, but our overall population, the percentage of women, isn't really shifting in the way that we want it to. So we've been doing work to really drill down into why is that? So what are the key areas that we need to put more attention into, and what are the interventions we could make? So it's not doing a sort of blanket thing. It's being quite specific and targeted at the challenges we're facing. So that, I think, is talking to this importance of being very specific. So I think probably the most common characteristic of organisations that aren't really getting anywhere is that it's effectively handed off to HR or to a diversity and inclusion team. So there's not that really strong business leadership ownership. And the other thing I would pull out is just initiativeitis. So the illusion that if you do lots and lots of initiatives and are terribly busy with it, that must be a good thing. And I actually think that a huge amount of effort is wasted by doing too much, but without the focus and without really thinking, if I do this initiative, it's going to produce that outcome, which is going to move us forward in this way. Mm-hmm. So it's like you're driving a car, but you haven't got the levers joined up.
Yeah. But being really intentional to drive action and change. For females and others as well, but especially females looking to, we've made great progress with board positions, especially in listed companies for sure, but there's still a lack. It's great to hear success at Babcock in particular, but still a lack of senior females. What's your message to women looking to secure those positions? So it's great that we can provide frameworks and structures, but also what do you see that you think, I wish we'd see a bit more of that, or any common traits or behaviours that you'd encourage?
Well, I think, I'm not sure it's exactly the answer to your question, but I think my advice to women would be, first of all, be optimistic. Really thinking about who you've got as senior sponsors who will support you in your career. Mm-hmm. And thinking about how robust that is. So, if you've got one or two sponsors, but they might both leave the organisation. So just think about building some strength into the range of people you've got as supporters. Mm-hmm. And the other very simple advice I would give is to pick your bosses to the extent that you can. Because I think, really supportive bosses can be a super help stepping up your career. So many organisations, I think, still operate in a kind of line manager lottery where, you can be lucky and have a really supportive line manager or not. Well, I think, try and navigate that. Try and, to the extent that you can, choose to work for people who have a really good reputation.
Solid advice. And you mentioned sponsors there and your experience as well with somebody who really helped champion you. And great suggestion about having a range so you have a resilient group of people. How did you go about identifying those sponsors or exploring that to start with?
I think it was much more by luck than intention. I mean, quite a lot of the people were those excellent bosses. The senior leader who did that pivotal thing in getting me into my first P&L role, it just came about in a very, very strange set of circumstances, actually. So I was running that team doing oil markets analysis, and I had to go to deputise for my boss's boss to give a presentation about the oil markets to the annual gathering of the absolute top management of Shell's downstream. And so I went along thinking this would almost certainly be the end of my career. I was the only woman presenting. I was at least 3 job levels lower than anyone else in the room. But it happened that what was happening in the oil markets was exactly what they wanted to hear, because it was during the Gulf War, and they were, it was absolutely hot news for them. So they were really minded to want to hear
Tuned
this.
in.
And because of the level of conference it was, my observation was that all the other presentations were probably on their 70th iteration, and mine was literally handwritten acetate slides done on the flight going over with the latest news. So it stood out, and being noticed is a good thing. And this guy was one of the people there, because I got noticed, I got recognized, and people said, "Who is this?" So, and that led to this senior leader going out of his way to follow up with me, and wanted to see what he could do to help.
Yeah, and making that opportunity yourself by that resilience you mentioned earlier.
Being there, being in
daring
the room.
to do it, frankly, as well. Yeah, excellent. So, addressing the future talent pipeline, can you share efforts that you're really championing to promote STEM-based careers to children and young people in particular?
Well, if I talk about Babcock, because it's close to home, if we talk about girls, we know that lots of girls decide early on at school that, that science is not for people like me. And then, so science and engineering, no. And then until recently, defence has had definitely a view of, I wouldn't want to do that. So, we know we've got a lot of barriers that we need to break down. And so we have a lot of our staff are signed up as STEM ambassadors. They go out into schools, they go into colleges. I think that we reckon that we engage with something like 1 in 150 school children in the country through all of that activity. And I think what's so important is, STEM ambassadors shouldn't be people like me. They should be people in their first job, people that school kids can relate to. And they can see, people like me with background like me are doing this sort of thing, and hear more about what it actually is. And then we open the gates, and thinking about it, we're in defence, so our sites are behind big fences.
Yes.
But we have open days. In the Festival of Engineering, we've brought about 1,500 kids into our sites. And so they can really see what we do. And I think also really importantly, it's to shift some of the language that we use talking about what we do. Because traditionally we've talked about the different types of nuclear engineering, systems engineering, electrical engineering. But we can also talk about the need for problem solvers and planners and organisers and team builders and innovators and lots of skills which are maybe feel much more resonant and accessible to girls. So it's just trying to open people's minds to what could be available to them. And one aspect of our diversity in this, which doesn't get talked about so much, but because we're looking at everything, we're also looking at how we can attract people who just haven't got the right qualifications and would never normally see a pathway into our workforce. But we've opened different routes. So as I said, where people get the opportunity to demonstrate the right attitude and aptitude, and then they can sort of do learning and training on the job so that they come in and develop proper skills and get into that workforce.
So having a more inclusive approach to the recruitment, it's not necessarily X degree and such. I have to say, I do believe there's absolutely a place for STEM ambassadors such as yourself as well. I think it's great to have that accessibility with people. So for leaders watching this now, what's your one piece of advice that everybody can take away to action tomorrow to really have a lens and a focus to help implement change for more inclusive workforces?
So, I mean, I think for senior people, the things I said about how you should structure what you're doing is really important. But I think for everyone, I would go back to this point that I think it is as simple as people want to be treated as people. So I think it's go out into the organization, talk to people, ask questions, listen. And that is just so empowering. And it's not difficult. Anyone can do it. It's just getting up and going walkabout.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for being so generous in sharing your experience, your career pathway and learnings and advice and counsel. I think there's some excellent points you've touched on there. So thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with me.